The lion's eyes closed fully now, no flicker remaining beneath the lids. The last of his body relaxed, muscles easing into stillness. The field around them seemed to shift with the change, insects humming faintly, a night bird calling in the distance, as if the land itself was marking the passage. The man did not move immediately. He stayed kneeling, holding the cub, bowing his head in quiet respect for the fallen animal at his side. The cub stirred once more, a faint sound pressing from its throat, softer than before. The man answered not with words this time, but with a slow rocking motion, his hand brushing gently against the young lion's back. A fragile calm began to settle, not peace, but a lull born of fatigue and trust, and in that quiet, a strange exchange seemed to rest between them. The lion, in his last breath, had given something forward, not in words, not in gesture, but in simple acceptance. The cub was no longer shielded by his strength, but placed into the uncertain hands of another. The man rose at last, carrying the small creature, his eyes lingering on the still figure upon the earth. The field was hushed, the night deep, and in that silence, the moment settled like a vow unspoken one, life-ending. Another carried forward. The cub's first nights without its father were marked by restless cries that broke the silence of the village edge. Carried into shelter, its small body shivered even when wrapped in cloth, the warmth of human touch foreign yet necessary. The man kept watch in those hours, kneeling close with a clay vessel of milk, feeding it drop by drop through a softened reed. At first, the cub resisted, turning its head, the instinct to accept from another creature buried deep beneath fear. But hunger outweighed hesitation. Slowly, reluctantly, it swallowed, each mouthful fragile, each pause filled with trembling. The villagers gathered at a distance, drawn by the strange sight but careful not to come too close. Their voices stayed hushed, their movements respectful. They saw the cub as both a wonder and a burden, a wild life that did not belong within their walls. Yet none interfered. They allowed the man his quiet work, watching only from the edges of light, as though bearing witness to something rare and fragile that must not be disturbed. Days lengthened into a pattern of patience. At dawn, the cub stirred weakly, blinking against the soft light that touched its eyes. The man offered food with steady hands, never rushing, never forcing, his voice low and even. "You're safe now," he murmured once. Words meant less for assurance and more as a rhythm to his care. The cub's body grew steadier in small measures. Where once it had lain curled and unmoving, it now lifted its head. Paws stretching stiffly across the mat of grass laid for its rest. At night the air cooled, carrying sharp winds from the open plain. The cub pressed against whatever warmth it could find, nose twitching, tiny body quaking with each shift of the breeze. The man built a simple enclosure of reeds and cloth, placing it where the air was softer, where shadows offered comfort rather than fear. He sat close through the darkest hours, listening to its shallow breathing, adjusting coverings when the cub stirred. Each movement was a reminder of the thin line it walked between survival and loss. With time, its eyes began to sharpen. Once clouded and heavy, they now flickered with clearer light, watching the man as he moved, following shapes and gestures. Its cries softened, no longer constant but occasional, carrying less desperation and more recognition. The cub's body responded and kind steps grew less uncertain, though still unsteady, its legs wobbling beneath its weight. When it stumbled, the man reached with open hands, not to hold it, but to steady the space around it, giving room for strength to find its way. The villagers noticed the change. Where once they whispered of its weakness, now they saw the small stirrings of growth. Children leaned from doorways to glimpse the cub, their parents drawing them back with a gentle caution. Yet even in their restraint, eyes lingered. The cub was becoming more than a fragile life, rescued at dusk. It was now a story unfolding before them, each breath a step further from death, each blink a spark rising from shadow. The man never claimed it as his own. His care remained quiet, temporary, a bridge between the wild past the cub had lost and the uncertain future waiting beyond. He fed it, warmed it, guarded it, but always with the patience of one who knew he was only holding it for a time. His hands bore scratches from its small claws, yet he accepted them without protest. Signs that the cub's strength was returning, that wildness remained intact. In those days of care, survival grew not through force but through gentleness. A fragile life, once trembling on the edge, began to lean toward strength. And though the nights were still long, though uncertainty still lingered, each small victory carried the promise of a life that had not yet given way to silence. The passing of months reshaped the cub into something sturdier. His once frail frame, now layered with lean muscle, his movements no longer unsteady but sure, fluid and deliberate. What had once trembled on the edge of collapse now carried the balance of survival. His coat, once rough and patchy, had grown into a soft golden layer that caught the morning light. He had learned the rhythm of feeding, the strength of small leaps, the sharpening of his senses and play against shadows and insects. The man had been there through it all, watching from a respectful distance as each stage of growth unfolded. The time came when the cub no longer cried at night, no longer sought warmth pressed against a wall or cloth. Instead, he lifted his head toward the sounds of the open land, ears twitching at the call of distant animals, nostrils flaring at scents carried from beyond the village. His paws grew restless, pressing against the soil as though feeling for ground he had never truly forgotten. The man understood this restlessness. Care was never meant to be permanent. His task had been to hold the young life steady until it could stand on its own. Now it stood ready to return. One morning, while the light stretched soft across the plains, the man prepared for the walk. The cub followed easily, no longer fearful of his presence but not bound to it either. He moved ahead at times, tail twitching, head lifting to scan the horizon. At others he fell back, brushing close as if testing the comfort of the familiar. Together they moved beyond the huts, beyond the last line of tilled soil, into the open sweep of grasslands that rolled endlessly outward. The air was filled with the calls of birds circling high, their wings catching the sun. The ground smelled of dust, of wild herbs crushed underfoot, of life stretched wide and untamed. The cub paused often, head lifting, ears catching the tremor of unseen movements. His muscles tightened with anticipation, not fear, as though his body knew this was the place it had been meant to grow into all along. At the edge of a rise, the man stopped. He rested his hand briefly against his knee, breathing in the land before them. The cub padded a few steps further, then turned back, eyes settling on the figure who had carried him through nights of weakness into this moment. The man's voice came low, carried softly by the breeze. "Go on," he said, a whisper more than a command. The cub hesitated, not from doubt but from the gravity of change. He lowered his head, brushing his muzzle against the air, then circled once, the movement restless and uncertain. Finally he pressed forward again, paws sinking into the taller grass, tail flicking with nervous energy. He stopped once more, turning his head slightly toward the man, a brief pause that held the weight of all that had passed between them. The man remained still, offering nothing but his presence. He did not reach, did not call again. He allowed the silence to speak, and in that silence, the cub turned away, body slipping deeper into the grass. Each step carried further into the wild. The stalks bent around him, parting and closing in waves, until only faint movement marked his passage. The man stood alone at the rise, watching until even those ripples disappeared. The wind moved across the land, lifting the grass in a rolling sway, carrying with it the unspoken truth of what had been left behind. The sun drifted lower, painting the horizon in muted gold. The field lay open and endless. The cub, now hidden within it, claimed once more by the world that had birthed him. The man turned back slowly, his steps quiet, while behind him the tall grass whispered in the wind, as though carrying forward the final gift of a father's sacrifice. The lion was already faltering when he came into view, each step heavy, his body swaying with exhaustion. His mane, once thick and commanding, hung in tangled clumps, dulled by time and illness. A wound stretched along his flank, deep and raw, carrying the smell of earth and blood. Yet still he moved forward, as if drawn by something beyond himself. At his side, pressed against the trembling frame of his legs, stumbled a cub barely more than a shadow of fur and bone. Fragile and uncertain, the land around them stretched wide and dry, a patchwork of brittle grass and broken soil. Beyond the open field, huts and wooden fences marked the edge of human settlement. It was a boundary wild lions rarely crossed, but this old male, stripped of his strength, had no thought of distance or fear. Each breath rattled his chest, each movement bent him closer to the ground. Still, his head remained low, eyes fixed on the earth ahead, guiding the cub toward a place he seemed to trust would hold safety. The cub whimpered softly, a thin sound nearly lost to the evening wind. Its steps faltered, legs shaking under the effort of keeping pace. The lion paused, lowering his heavy frame so the cub could press against him, hiding beneath the ragged sweep of his mane. For a moment, he gathered himself, shoulders rising and falling like waves breaking against stone. Then he pushed onward, dragging his body with a stubborn rhythm. Every motion deliberate, every step a piece of his final strength surrendered for the young life beside him. The sun hung low, bleeding light across the plain. Dust clung to the lion's paws, marking a trail that wavered toward the border of human ground. His body sagged with the weight of years, yet his eyes, clouded though they were, still carried clarity. There was no fight left in him, no roar, no pride to defend. Only this cub, nudged forward with the last force his life could give. From the village, a few figures appeared at a distance, drawn by the strange sight. They stopped far back, hushed, watching as the wild creature staggered closer. Fear held them still, but awe kept them rooted. The old lion lifted his head once more, mane shivering with emotion, and exhaled a sound that was not a roar but a sigh, low and spent. The cub pressed tighter against him, eyes wide, tiny ribs pulsing with shallow breaths. The ground seemed to shift beneath the lion as his legs weakened. His body lurched, and he sank to one knee, then forced himself upright again. The movement was clumsy, desperate, but he would not collapse yet. He crossed the last stretch of open field, stopping at the border where the grass thinned and the first stones of the path began. There, he lowered himself slowly, as if laying down a burden. The cub toppled beside him, curling into the shelter of his mane. The lion's chest heaved, drawing in the evening air with effort. His head lifted once, gaze sweeping toward the distant line of people, then fell back. A faint growl left his throat, not of threat, but of weariness, a voice emptied of anger, leaving only the truth of his fatigue. The cub cried again, a thin, questioning note that echoed into the stillness. The lion pressed his muzzle briefly to the small body, a gesture so quiet it almost passed unseen. Then he stilled, body heavy against the ground, sides rising and falling with a rhythm that faltered more with each breath. The light around them softened, stretching long shadows across the field. A father's strength had carried him to this final edge. Now, only the cub remained, trembling in the hush of dusk, waiting in the place where two worlds touched. The lion's body was still now, pressed against the earth with only the faintest rise and fall of his chest. His mane spread like a shadow over the cub, who clung close, its small sides heaving with uncertain breath. The evening had deepened into silence, broken only by the restless cry of the young one, a thin sound that quivered through the air. Each note carried both fear and longing, as if calling for comfort it did not understand. From the edge of the field, a man began to move forward. He had been standing with the others, watching in quiet disbelief, yet something within him drew him closer. His steps were slow, careful on the hardened ground, his eyes fixed on the great lion's frame. The weight of danger pressed upon him, for even a dying predator could summon sudden power, but compassion pressed harder. His breath was shallow, his hands loose at his sides, each movement measured so as not to disturb the fragile stillness. The cub lifted its head as the man approached, wide eyes reflecting the fading light. It gave another cry, sharper now, legs stumbling as it tried to press further against the body of its father. The lion stirred faintly at the sound, a low rumble echoing in his chest, neither fierce nor threatening, but soft and strained, as though answering the cub's call with the last of his strength. His head shifted, muzzle brushing the cub, then sank back into the dust. The man stopped a few paces away, lowering himself to one knee. The sight before him stilled even his fear. The lion's body was immense yet hollowed by time, muscles thinned, his once proud frame bent and weary. Breath rattled within him like wind through dry reeds. The cub pressed its face into his mane, trembling, then turned its gaze toward the man. Its small ribs shivered with each breath, each sound it made more fragile than the last. The man's voice came low, barely more than a whisper. "Easy now," he said, the words carrying no demand, only calm. He remained where he was, offering stillness rather than intrusion. The cub tilted its head, a faint moan leaving its throat, then tucked itself once more against the lion's side. Around them the dusk deepened, colors softening into muted blues and golds. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and grass, mingled with the metallic trace of blood from the lion's wound. Insects hummed at the edges of the field, but the central space remained hushed, as if the land itself held its breath. The lion's eyes opened once more, clouded yet steady, fixing briefly on the man kneeling nearby. There was no threat in them, no fire left to burn, only a flicker of awareness. The man did not move, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his head lowered slightly as though acknowledging the weight of the moment. Between them stretched a fragile thread, not of conquest or fear, but of quiet recognition. The cub whimpered again, pawing weakly at the lion's chest, trying to rouse him. The old lion answered with one final breath, deep but uneven, chest rising and falling in a slow surrender. The man's shoulders shifted, a silent exhale leaving him, for he knew what was passing before his eyes. The cub pressed close, ears flattened, voice thin and high in the gathering dark. The silence that followed was heavy yet tender, as if the world had softened around the fading of this life. The man remained there, steady and still, his presence no longer one of intrusion but of witness. The cub's fragile cries continued, each sound cutting through the dusk, small echoes against the immensity of loss. And so they remained man-cub, and the lion's final breath together in the quiet field as night unfolded around them. The night air thickened with quiet, the kind of stillness that presses against the skin. The old lion's chest rose and fell unevenly, the sound of his breath shallow, fading with each exhale. Beside him, the cub shifted restlessly, a thin cry escaping its throat, high-pitched and uncertain. It pressed its head into the warmth of its father's mane, pawing faintly as though urging life to return. But the great body no longer answered. Only the trembling of the cub spoke into the silence. The man knelt closer, moving with the care of someone approaching fragile ground. His shadow stretched long in the dim light, his hand hovering just above the soil, before resting slowly against it for balance. The lion's eyes opened once more, heavy lids pulling upward with effort. They fixed on the man not with fire, but with a clarity born of surrender. The gaze held for a breath, perhaps two. Before sliding toward, the cub pressed tight against his side. The man's chest tightened as he watched. He could feel the weight of decision pressing on the moment, though no words passed between them. His hand reached forward, slow and deliberate, settling first near the cub, rather than on it. The small creature startled at the movement, a tiny hiss breaking from its throat before it quieted again, its fragile body shivering against the earth. The lion shifted faintly, head lowering until his muzzle brushed the cub one final time. The touch was almost imperceptible, yet it carried a depth no roar could hold. His breath left in a long exhale, warm against the cub's fur, before faltering into silence. The man lowered his head, eyes fixed on the stillness that followed, his voice quiet and low. "It's all right, little one." The cub whimpered again, pressing closer to the unmoving body, confused by the absence of response. Its small tail twitched in fits, ears flattened as it shifted back and forth, unable to settle. The man, steady in his patience, waited for the moment when the cub's searching eased. Then, with a gentleness rare between species, he reached forward. His hands moved around the small frame, scooping it with care, his touch firm enough to support, soft enough not to restrain. The cub resisted at first, tiny claws pressing against his arm, a muffled cry leaving its throat. But exhaustion weighed heavier than fear. After a few moments, it sagged against him, trembling but still. The man pressed it close to his chest, feeling the faint thrum of its rapid heartbeat against his own. His other hand remained low, touching the earth beside the lion, an unspoken acknowledgement of the life that had just ended.